So, I saw The Rise of Skywalker, and I didn't like it very much. It's difficult to even know where to begin. I'd like to do some kind of script doctor, but there were just so many questionable decisions, and ultimately, I just kind of want to talk about all the dumb stuff that happened. There's so much to unpack. But I did have a fun idea of how I could organize it into a wonderful, internet-friendly, numbered list. So this will be a list of all the dumb stuff that happened in The Rise of Skywalker. This list is vaguely chronological, but it also handily builds from the lesser offenses to the very worst ones. And that said, it is a big spoiler for just everything that happens, which I guess is kind of like saying that everything that happens is dumb. That's not what I meant, but that's what it sounds like. Okay, anyway, ready? Let's go on this journey together, yippee! Number 1, the opening crawl. I realize this is the very first thing we see, and that even if I tried, I couldn't possibly find an earlier thing to complain about, unless the Lucasfilm logo found a way to be bad, which maybe it's just a matter of time. I actually kind of love this opening crawl. It's very hammy in a way that it should be. It starts strong with the words, "The dead speak," with an exclamation point, which is wonderful. They're supposed to make you feel like you're jumping into an episode of an adventure serial, so the tone is right where it needs to be. However, if you look at the other opening crawls from other Star Wars films, they usually ask a bit less of you. They usually set up what Star War is going on, who the different sides are, if one side is pulling ahead. Usually they'll say the general locations of our heroes and what the nature of the current mission or adventure is that we're about to jump into the middle of in the first scene. Between films in the trilogy, there is usually a passage of time, characters have moved around, but if there's anything crazy or status quo breaking, they're presumably going to want to save it for not the opening crawl. Episode 9's opening crawl is Palpatine is alive! He's been posting Snapchats for months, or he's a really old guy, so Facebook Lives or whatever. A major dead character is back to life. He came back off screen. That's a thing that happens now. And it just doesn't explain how or why. Opening crawls are supposed to catch you up to speed, not make you go, wait, run that by me again. So, number 2, Palpatine is alive. It doesn't make any sense that Palpatine is alive. I mean, I guess I can't pretend I would rather have an explanation, because I assume any explanation they did write, like any of the other explanations in this movie, would be inadequate and stupid, and then I would just be less happy, so fine. There's this wonderful scene where the Resistance is standing around, and then one of them says, "Somehow Palpatine has returned." And that just kind of sums it up. They should have just had that as the opening crawl. Then they elaborate with a few guesses. The line is, "Dark science, cloning, secrets only the Sith knew." I feel like we're just reading the script notes, that was written in the margin. They were gonna pick one, then they didn't bother. Although the worst of all of those is the cloning one, considering Palpatine looks more ravaged by time and hardship than ever before. You'd think if cloning had been involved at any point, he'd be looking smooth and sexy. So anyway, he's alive, but he's really weak, and he gets hoisted around by this giant hydraulic arm that's mounted on the ceiling, like a big baby bouncer, but scary. He's in a big spooky fortress with all these cables coming off of him and stuff. I have so many issues with Palpatine, but they'll be covered in later points, so we're gonna move on. Number 3, Palpatine made Snoke. So in Kylo's confrontation with Palpatine at the very beginning of the movie, he's like, "I'm not scared of you. I've already killed Snoke." And then Palpatine is like, "I made Snoke." I definitely took this to mean that he had gotten Snoke to where he is, maybe set him up in his position of authority, or he was his master and trained him or something. But then the camera pans past this test tube thing where he is currently in the process of growing 2 more Snokes, and you're like, oh, he literally made Snoke. So, okay, why did Palpatine make Snoke? He said he has been every voice inside Kylo Ren's head for his whole life, and while he's doing it, he's mimicking the voices of Snoke and Vader. So, was he puppeteering Snoke? And that was his voice? Certainly the voices that were in Kylo's head turning him to the dark side were his voice, but then when Snoke the man was talking, was that also his voice? How in control was he of the dialogue? If his ultimate goal was to turn Ben Solo to the dark side and he was already doing the Vader voice in his head and then he succeeded, why did he need Snoke? Why did he need a puppet thing that looks like Snoke and is named Snoke? You mean to tell me that when Palpatine needed to create a creature who could take over control of a government without anyone becoming suspicious and then win over the trust and affection of a little boy, the best he could come up with was this? Hello, little boy. My name is Papa Snoke. When does he release the Snokes into the world? Do they start out that shriveled, or does he wait for them to get as shriveled as possible, like a pickle? Do they live out their lives outside of the tube, or does he always deploy them fully formed? And why did he make more? What are they going to do for him at this point? Number 4, Palpatine uses his powers to raise up like 500 Star Destroyers and all of their crews and stuff out of the ocean where he has been hiding them. I'm not even gonna question the fleet because I don't care enough. I don't want to unpack that. We all know it's stupid. That's not what I'm here to do. But my issue is that he has the power to lift all these Star Destroyers out of the ocean, like lifting these massive objects. It's very powerful. But if you pick him up over your head to throw him off a railing, he goes, "Ah, put me down. Stop that." And then he dies. Number 5, at a point in the story at which Kylo Ren has already found out that the voice of Vader was Palpatine the whole time, and he's not even loyal to Palpatine, and he's figuring out a way to defy his orders, he then goes to his room and touches the Darth Vader helmet in order to commune with it, as though he still thinks it's Darth Vader. I guess this whole sequence with the Vader mask was probably already shot before they rewrote the script to have Palpatine be in it, and then they just forgot that the two of them conflicted with each other and it didn't make sense anymore. That's why you rewatch the movie you've made from start to finish before you put it out in theaters. Number 6, Jannah. There wasn't really anything wrong with Jannah. I liked the way she was portrayed by her actress, and I liked her warthog horse, but I assume Jannah was just put in here to assure us that Finn isn't gay for Poe because Rose Tico was fired from that job and then written out of the movie. So the writers, I assume, asked themselves, what should a love interest for Finn be like? Oh, I know, she'll just kind of be Finn. Jannah is a former stormtrooper, like Finn. She left when she was ordered to fire on civilians, the same as Finn. I don't know, the laziness of it just staggered me. It reminded me of Alvin and the Chipmunks and the Chipettes. You know how the boys just date female versions of themselves? 7, anytime a character arrives on a planet in this movie, they have a shot of the character walking away from their landed spaceship. I guess because they were worried that if they didn't have that shot, we'd be like, how did they get on this planet? Through what means of transportation? This one kind of speaks for itself. It's just a little thing that I thought was weird. And they're never climbing out of the spaceship either. I assume because the spaceship is entirely CGI, or it's like a static prop that doesn't open. So yeah, add that to your drinking game if you want to, especially on Exegol. I think it happens 3 times in a row there. Number 8, Chewbacca exploding. So walk me through how this happens. Finn, from 30 feet away, watches with his own eyeballs as Chewbacca is loaded onto a transport in the middle of this huge, open, barren desert. This next bit is shot like a comedy. So Rey is in the middle of something, and then she hears Finn yelling, "Rey!" And then she turns around, and Finn, runs out from behind a rock, and he's waving his arms frantically, and he's like, "Rey, they got Chewie! They got him!" And then, exactly like it's a comedy beat, a perfectly timed transport rises up from behind the rock. And then Finn exaggeratedly points to it, and he's like, "That transport! Chewie's on there! That one!" Then Rey tries to grab it with the Force to stop it from leaving, and I was like, oh no, what if she makes it crash by mistake? Because, pulling on a ship that's in flight could be dangerous, I would assume. Instead, Force lightning erupts out of her hands, and the ship explodes before their eyes into hundreds of fiery pieces. To make things even funnier after it happens, Finn is like, "No," but it's not the right kind of no. He kind of just seems annoyed, and then he throws his arms down in an "oh man" kind of gesture. It looks like the kind of no that you do if you're like a high school football coach and your team has lost the ball and not when your friend is exploding. There were a lot of moments like that in the film where like the characters seemed like they reacted wrong, like maybe the actor didn't know what they were reacting to in that moment, or maybe like they were reacting to a different thing and then the editor pulled a reaction from the wrong time, or this is just the footage they had and that thing had not originally happened and they're like, well, we got a shot where he says no, so we'll just use that. Anyway, like a lot of things in this movie that didn't really ultimately work for me, I felt like the idea of Rey exploding Chewbacca by mistake through like dark side magic was a very cool concept. You know, Rey will blame herself. She will grapple with the responsibility of her force powers and whether or not she can be trusted, and maybe there will be tension with her friends. But no, again, like a lot of things in this story, it's not treated with the emotional weight you feel like it calls for. Rey feels really, really bad. She's like really upset, and then the scene changes, and then they have more adventures to do, and she just kind of like forgets about it and is back to her plucky self. They don't really unpack it from there. In fact, they're on the next planet in their mission, and they start saying things like, if we don't succeed, Chewie will have died for nothing. And they say it like that, like passively, like he'll have died for nothing, not Rey murdered him. Kylo Ren also didn't react in any way to Chewie exploding. Like he seemed more intrigued that Rey had that power and not like, oh, hey, I've known that big furry monster since I was a baby. Like, he's a family friend that I presumably know quite well. I know he hasn't had a good relationship with Chewie in recent years, but I don't know, you'd think he'd feel some kind of way about it. But then none of this even matters because it turns out that Finn mixed up the transports. Chewie wasn't on that ship. Good news, Rey, you just exploded other sentient people, but not Chewie, so it's actually fine. And also, man, Finn, how did you mess that up? Because you seemed pretty confident at the time. I feel like if you're going to pull this kind of contrived switcheroo, you need to have some kind of scene to set it up ahead of time. Like maybe when our heroes are on Pasaana and there's that festival, they could have a street vendor who's set up a table and he's doing the shell game. And then Finn tries to play it like a bunch of times in a row and he just keeps losing and you're like, wow, Finn is really bad at object permanence. Even the reveal that Chewie is alive is very bizarre. It's a scene on the First Order ship and two officers are saying like, we had a lot of casualties, presumably because Rey exploded them, but we do have one valuable captive. And then Chewie walks in looking glum and wearing handcuffs and a collar. But because Chewie is alive and we're meant to feel happy about that, they have this like very triumphant John Williams score, and it just feels very like jarring and out of place against this footage of a sad Wookiee in handcuffs. Chewbacca himself didn't even do like a daring escape. It was just like a dumb mix-up. There's no active heroism happening, just tonally it feels very weird. Number 9, the map to Exegol. It's really fun to see heroes go on team building adventures, but in the last movie of a series, when there is clearly so much ground they want to cover, it's unfathomably stupid to have your heroes go to 3 different planets to get one map. They go to the first planet to get a knife that has a description of where the map is, then they go to a second planet to get a translation of the description of where the map is from the knife, then they go to the third planet to retrieve the map itself before they can finally go to the 4th planet, which is the one they wanted to go to. I get that it's the journey, not the destination, but this is too much journey, and honestly, they should have cut at least one of the planets. Like, I think even just one would be a huge difference, and it would give the characters a lot more time to emotionally react to things so that the audience can feel those emotions too, and just give it time to breathe and like have real interactions and establish real stakes. Personally, I think they should have cut the Carrie Russell planet. I love Carrie Russell, but that was the most useless one, and she's just a new character that we don't need to know. All it really accomplished was giving us Poe's racist background as a drug dealer. And then obviously that doesn't matter anyway, because in the course of one conversation, his friends are like, what, you dealt drugs? And he's like, it was a long time ago. And then they're all fine again. The funniest part of the movie is when Rey finally gets one of the Wayfinders, and she like messages the Resistance, and she's uploading copies of the map so they can get there too. And then Independently, Dio rolls into the room and also has a map. So it's like they spent forever getting these maps and suddenly there are so many maps, you don't even know what to do with all these maps. Everybody's got a map. The map knife was also insane. There's an evil Sith knife made so that if you stand in the exact correct location on the correct crest of the correct beach at the right angle, you can hold up the knife and then the carvings on the side of the knife line up with the wreckage of the outside of the Death Star. If the wreckage gets worn down anymore by the raging ocean that it's sitting in, I guess this knife is just going to be functionless now. So anyway, you hold up the knife and it lines up to the outside of the wreckage, and then you pull out this little arm thing, which has not been established. First time we're seeing this little arm thing, and then the little arm points to where you're going to find the map inside the Death Star wreckage. I don't know how it accounts for depth or the fact that the Death Star is so huge that you would think that just pointing to something on the outside is like pointing to a globe and being like, it's in California. Anyway, before our heroes had this knife, it was in the possession of Ochi, an evil alien who was tasked with bringing Rey to Palpatine. So you mean to tell me that Palpatine asked a guy to deliver something to him as soon as possible, but for the return journey he was just like, here's a knife that will lead you to a map of where I am? I'm just going to assume that he also puts all of his Postmates drivers through this rigmarole as like a power play. Number 10, Rey's parents sold her to protect her. So Kylo Ren tells Rey that he didn't lie to her in the last movie and that her parents are nobodies, but only because they chose to be. Which sounds like a lie, or at least a serious retcon, but okay. It turns out Rey's parents did love her. They just had to send her away to protect her from Palpatine. And then he says they sold you to protect you, which is the worst line in the whole movie. I just love this concept. They wanted to protect her, but yes, money did change hands. Also, in hindsight, the fact that they haggled was a little gauche. And they did spend the money on space tequila. None of the rest of it makes any sense either, in case you were worried. Since Rey did successfully stay hidden for so long, we have to assume that tracking her through use of the Force is not possible. So okay, gonna write that possibility off. So if you want to hide a child that you love and keep her safe, isn't selling her off to an extremely mercenary and selfish junk dealer like the worst place you could possibly put her? Because if anyone comes around asking questions, he's gonna sell her down the river the first chance he gets. Apparently Jakku is remote enough that you can just disappear through normal means. Why didn't the whole family just go into hiding on Jakku? Why did Rey have to be by herself? You'd think even if they wanted to lead Ochi or bounty hunters or whatever away, they could have sent like one parent to look after Rey, and then the other one is like, I'll sacrifice myself and lead them away, but she won't be a sad orphan like working for a living in the desert and getting beaten and starved. Why not find like a kindly old lady somewhere and then leave Rey on her doorstep in the dead of night so the lady doesn't see your face and you can't be connected to her? Why not just go to the Resistance and they'll look after her because they don't like Palpatine? Rey's parents were apparently immediately caught and interrogated about Rey's location, but it didn't work. They kept it a secret. So if it was that easy, couldn't they have taken her someplace nice and not miserable and then kept that a secret? Then let's unpack Ochi and that whole sequence of events because I don't get it. When Rey is in the desert with her friends, she sees Ochi's ship and she's like, I've seen this ship before. That's already a funny sentiment to me in Star Wars. Like, spaceships are mass produced, right? I don't sit in traffic and like see a blue Honda Civic and go, I've seen this car before. But anyway, she sees the ship and it looks familiar, and later it's revealed that the ship belongs to Ochi, the bad guy that her grandfather sent to get Rey and the guy that killed her parents. So Ochi went to find Rey, but he found her parents, who by that point had already sold her to protect her. Rey's mom successfully hides her location by saying, and I quote, she isn't on Jakku. And I guess that didn't seem suspicious, and he never followed up because for the next like 14 years, Rey stayed hidden on Jakku and it worked. So then Ochi just stabs both of Rey's parents to death with the knife that's also his map. You'd think he'd use a different knife because now his map, it's all covered with blood. What if he had accidentally dulled the blade and then it didn't line up anymore and he's like, I don't know what to do with this knife? But remember, Ochi's ship looked familiar to Rey, who had not been taken aboard by Ochi, so why did it look familiar? I tried to go back to her Force vision in episode 7 because there's that scene where her parents are leaving in a ship and she's yelling, come back, to the ship. And I think it kind of looked like Ochi's ship. I think it was supposed to be. So wait, did Ochi apprehend Rey's parents on Jakku? And when he did that, was Rey just within sight? Like she had just been sold, she was still in the middle of being dragged away, and Ochi somehow didn't notice, and he didn't hear her, and he didn't see her, he didn't think to just like look around a 100-foot radius? Or maybe my first line of thinking was right, and her parents just left on a ship, and then Ochi apprehended them, and it was the same model of ship because they're mass-produced. Rey, honey, your parents just also left in a blue Honda Civic. It's not the same one. Number 11, the spy. So there is a spy in the First Order that has been sending information to the Resistance for the whole movie, and like a bit before it, I guess. There's this new character in the First Order, General Pryde, and like they really want you to think he's the spy. You've never seen this character before, but they keep cutting to him and like his suspicious looking face, specifically anytime people are talking about catching that darn spy. He makes sinister expressions right into the camera, his face cast sinisterly, half in shadow. Like I rewatched it, I was watching him thinking, does this make sense if he's not the spy? It doesn't. He's just pretending to be the spy for the benefit of the invisible audience on the other side of the fourth wall. I'm honestly surprised they didn't put General Pryde in like one of those souvenir I'm the Rebel Spy t-shirts from Disneyland. But anyway, I figured that since they were spelling it out so much, he was definitely not going to be the spy. The first time I watched it, they mentioned the spy, and then they cut to Pryde, and then they cut to Hux, and I was immediately like, the spy is Hux, even though that didn't make any sense. Well, surprise, the spy is Hux. So this is really stupid, but also it was one of the only moments of pure joy that I felt in this film because it was so stupid that I loved it. So Hux helps our heroes, demonstrating that he is the spy, but then he also turns to the audience and it like zooms in on his face and he goes, I'm the spy, and it's great. I don't know, it was just so cheesy that it made me feel something, which most of this film did not. Anyway, then they ask him his motivations because what? And he reveals that he doesn't care if their side wins, he just needs Kylo Ren to lose. Remember at the end of the last movie, I had observed that Hux hates Kylo Ren, and I had theorized that maybe Hux was going to have a coup in this movie so he could like overthrow Kylo Ren, who he hates, but become more powerful within this system that he cares deeply about. Instead, Hux decided to express this hatred by betraying his own side of the war in order to make Kylo Ren lose. A course of action that has a 100% chance of leading to his own death, either when he's discovered as the spy, or when the resistance he's helping gains enough ground to explode one of the warships he lives on full time. So in the very next scene, Hux returns to the bridge, and then is discovered as the spy and shot dead. And then he's just dead, and it never matters again. Then J.J. Abrams is like, ladies and gentlemen, tonight the role of General Hux will be played by General Pryde. And then we just have this old guy who's the same as Hux and doing things that Hux could have just been doing. But now it's a new character, and Hux was the spy, and aren't we glad that happened? It added so much. And then Hux is never mentioned again. Nice cul-de-sac, guys. I assume that was added to fill time because our plates weren't full enough yet. Number 12, Leia's death and prophecy and everything else involving Leia. We learned that Luke was training Leia to be a Jedi, and then on the very last night of her Jedi training, Leia had a vision. In this prophecy, she sees the death of her son at the end of her Jedi path. So she decides to not pursue being a Jedi, I guess. So then later in the movie, to fulfill her destiny or something, she picks up the Medal of Yavin and walks into her room and lies down to die. As Rey and Kylo Ren are fighting on the wreckage of the Death Star, Kylo Ren senses Leia's death happening in the Force, and he looks off distracted, and then Rey fatally stabs him through the gut with his own lightsaber. It's unclear what Leia's goal was. Was she aware of what Ben was up to, and her intent was to distract him? Because she somehow knew that if he got stabbed and then healed, he would turn good again, so that's what he needed. I guess Leia died the way she lived. Meaning well, but ultimately hurting her son and making things more difficult for him. I tried to ask some of my friends what their takeaway was from this scene, and some of them said that they thought Leia died because of what was happening, like she was helping Rey from a distance to heal Kylo Ren, and then that's what killed her. But I rewatched it, and that's not what's happening. Leia's hand goes limp, and then she definitely dies, and Rey processes her death before she heals Kylo Ren. So that's not it. Man, if only the Force could have clarified that her son would die at the end of her Jedi path, but not as a direct consequence of it, so she could just be a Jedi and like live her best life. Plus, the phrasing is not only misleading, it's kind of backwards, because it says her son will die at the end of her Jedi path. So if we want to get like creative with it, I guess Kylo Ren dies when she dies, because the moment at which he's healed is the moment his redemption is solidified. But in all of the language they've used so far, there's been a distinction between Kylo Ren and your son, with Kylo Ren always being a different character. So if anything, if Kylo Ren died and Ben Solo didn't, her son didn't die. If anything, the prophecy should have been, your son will be born again. And then Leia would just assume that her son joined like an evangelical mega church somewhere. Also unrelated, but this is stupid. After Leia dies, there are 2 different scenes of characters reacting to it. The first shows a character that I think is the medical officer looking at her dead body under a sheet and being like, goodbye, dear princess. And then all of the peripheral characters at the Resistance base like stand around behind her looking sad. The only character we know in this scene is Rose, and nobody there is having like an intimate emotional reaction to the news. They don't have any dialogue. They're all posed in this very stilted way, like cheated out toward the audience, like it's the end of Act 1 in a high school production of Our Town. You feel like somebody is very proud of this shot. And then immediately afterward it cuts to daytime and Poe is arriving, and then he finds out she's dead and he reacts to it, and it's like they're back to back. Why is it happening? This is just another one of those moments that's like, who's editing this? Like, pick one, guys, and pick the second one, because it was a main character having an authentic emotional reaction. But you can't have both. To make things worse, then they just have Leia's corpse lying around for the rest of the movie. It eventually vanishes and becomes one with the Force, but not until much later, at the exact moment that Ben's body vanishes. And I don't really know what the point of that was. I assume this was to try to fit the prophecy better. Like, now he's dead, and now her Jedi path is over, so that's why that's the point at which her body disappears. But if so, that doesn't count. The Force is a liar, and just because your dead body is around doesn't mean you're still on your Jedi path. I don't think you're putting in a lot of Jedi heroics while you're lying dead on a cot under a sheet. Whatever reason they did this, it means that her body is just there, around for an uncomfortable amount of time, especially considering the real-life death of Carrie Fisher. I just thought it was a little ghoulish to have her body double lying around dead the whole time. The most awkward point is when later Poe and Lando are having a conversation, and Poe is like, how did you do it? Like referring to the rebellion back in the old war, and Lando's like, we had each other. And he says it without a trace of irony as, I kid you not, in the foreground of the shot, Leia's dead body is lying right there. Also, it's extremely stupid that Leia died cradling the medal of Yavin in her hands. I refuse to believe that just because it's a thing the audience recognizes from the old movies, it has to also be her most important possession at the time of her death. Number 13 is Finn's arc. But when I wrote arc, I put it in quotes to indicate my disdain. In The Force Awakens, Finn goes from being a stormtrooper to being somebody who learns how to have friends and how to be a loyal friend to the people that he cares about. In The Last Jedi, he learns not just to care about himself and his own friends, but a whole cause and like the concept of justice. In The Rise of Skywalker, he shouts Rey a lot. He always wants to be near Rey. And then when Rey is nearby, he wants to shout, Rey, and have her look over at him. At one point in the movie, Rey is in the middle of having a sword fight on a windswept, precarious, slippery metal wreckage, and even then, Finn wants to yell, Rey! It's a good thing Kylo Ren wasn't actually trying to kill her in that scene, or her head would have just been chopped right off her shoulders. It was played so weird. This is another one of those reactions where I'm like, did they know what they were reacting to? I could understand Finn seeing that Rey is in mortal peril, and then kind of involuntarily yelling Rey as like an oh no kind of thing. But if you watch the way John Boyega plays it, he like throws his whole body forward and cups his hands around his mouth and goes, Rey, like he's trying to get her attention. By that point, he'd done this so many times that I wanted Rey mid-sword fight to just yell back, like, what, Finn? What? Like, what's his follow-up gonna be? If he gets her attention, is he gonna yell, look out, Rey? you're in a sword fight. Finn's neediness in this one is intense, and sometimes it comes across as a little selfish, but mostly it's just depressing. In the past, it's been suggested that he's into Rey, and then left sort of unclear where she stands on all this. Maybe she's just oblivious that he likes her romantically, or maybe she only likes him platonically, or maybe she'll come around to it. Whatever the case, she at least cares deeply about his well-being, and loves him as a friend if nothing else. In this film, she seems straight up annoyed by him, and it's real sad. She seems annoyed that he wants to go along with her to anything. She ditches him without telling him. At one point, she force throws him really roughly. I get that Rey's busy, and like he is really clingy in this one, so I get why she's acting that way, but it doesn't make it any less depressing. Finn, just move on. She's not that into you. It's gonna be okay. They even keep putting him in scenes with other totally viable love interests and then shutting down each of those in turn. I normally wouldn't care that basically every character ended this film single, but like in Finn's case, they specifically characterized him as wanting a relationship, which makes it kind of sad. That sets it up as this thing that needs to be resolved, and it just never is. If they knew they weren't going to give this concept closure, they just shouldn't have dragged it back in to begin with. There's even this scene where they're drowning in quicksand and Finn thinks he's going to die and he yells, "I never got to tell you," and then he gets cut off. And then later Rey's like, "What were you going to say?" And he acts all embarrassed and secretive and doesn't want to tell anybody. It's pretty obvious that he was going to make a romantic confession because, like, based on how he acted, that's the only thing that makes sense. And I guess in a fan panel, J.J. Abrams has since said that no, he was just going to tell Rey that he's force sensitive. And like, that makes no sense as a dying confession or as a thing that you would be hesitant to bring up later when they asked you about it. So what I'm saying is that J.J. Abrams was lying. That thing he said wasn't true. He'd probably read some negative reviews at that point and like realized belatedly that he had done Finn dirty, and he's like, I'll just pretend it was something else. Oh, that reminds me. Number 14, Finn is force sensitive. I like the idea of Finn discovering he's force sensitive just fine, especially with this notion of Rey being the last Jedi and this being the last movie. It seems kind of nice to suggest like, oh yeah, there are other Jedi, the force is manifesting in other people all over the place. The Jedi aren't over. A spark of hope, whatever. But it's just handled so badly. I mean, it's the same as everything else. It's like, if you're going to bring this in, develop it a little, explore the concept, do something, or have the Force awaken in him in some triumphant moment in which he's able to actually positively influence the plot and like help his friends. Instead, he starts demonstrating his Force ability in like the last 40 minutes, and he only has it in the sense that he can like detect from a distance what's happening, like if characters die or are in danger or if good things happen. He definitely didn't have that ability on Pisano when he had no idea what ship Chewie was on. He never even does anything cool with the Force, he just reacts to things that he's sensing. I honestly think the only reason they gave him the Force is so that when he's not around Rey, he can still worry about Rey and say, Rey, because they don't know what else to do with him. Number 15, the Knights of Ren are dumb and then they die. Don't have a lot to say about that. They really might as well have not existed this whole time. Intermission time! We're in the home stretch now, we're a little over halfway, and we're coming up on the truly dumb stuff. So I'd like to take a brief intermission to talk about some things that I actually liked. I liked when Rey gets the necklace at the festival, and then she force connects to Kylo Ren, and he like plays it cool the whole conversation, and then right when they're about to disconnect, he grabs the necklace, knowing that he can use it to find her location. That was a good oh snap moment, and it was clever of him. I also liked the other time they're force connected when she's in his room, and he's on the planet trying to find her, and then when they start cutting up his stuff, he realizes where she is. That was good tension. I liked the C-3PO comedy, and I like C-3PO. People find him annoying. I don't. I like him. I love Ian McDiarmid as Palpatine. He brings me so much joy. He always gives it 150%. He's so over the top and hammy, and like, you just can't not enjoy watching him. I do think it's stupid that Palpatine is in this movie, and he shouldn't have been here, but it's still nice to see him. I liked getting to see redeemed Kylo Ren running around in his pajamas and using a blaster like he's Han Solo. Chewie gets the Medal of Yavin at the end, which is very stupid, but the next time you watch it, please pay attention to when they cut away from him back to the wide shot, because they've clearly instructed everyone around him to just like pantomime that they're happy for him for getting the medal, and like their body language as they're trying to convey this is very funny. So yeah, watch for that. I liked the insane sound effect when Palpatine drops Kylo Ren on a stone slab and it sounded like every bone in his body was shattered. It sounded like somebody dropped a watermelon off a roof. I liked that 7-foot tall yellow slug. I like him so much. I liked most of the beginning of the movie where the main trio is adventuring together. I was keenly aware the whole time that it was taking up loads of time, and I was thinking, That's weird. Don't they have lots of ground to cover later on, and they're squandering their time on this? And it turned out that they had even more ground to cover than I initially had thought they did. So, that was a bad use of time, but it's still fun to watch. I like when characters bond with their friends. Okay, let's get back to the dumb stuff. Number 16, things I put on my prediction bingo cards ironically, but then they actually happened in the film. I like to format my Star Wars predictions as bingo cards, and this year I wanted to play with all my friends when we went to the premiere, so I made 4 other bingo cards as alternatives. I just kind of filled their cards with things that weren't my predictions, and they were just kind of stupid to me, but I thought maybe. And some of the squares were just downright insane. And I called the cards that weren't my predictions the chaos cards, because there's no way this would happen, right? Anyway, here are all the squares on those cards that actually came true. Rey Palpatine. Rose never gets to go outside. I mean, they're physically outside, but she doesn't get to leave the base. Kylo dies. The Skywalker in the title is Rey. I'll hate the movie. Leia dies, but then she also returns as a Force ghost. A new main character discovers Force ability. They go back to Tatooine. Palpatine explodes in a brilliant corona of light. Ewok cameo. And my favorite, Incel Rey. Number 17, the entire climax of the movie. So Rey goes to kill Palpatine because he's the bad guy. She's standing right in front of him. She's gonna do it. And then Palpatine says, "Yes, good. Kill me. That is what I want. Once you kill me, I will take over your body, and the Sith will rule." So then, obviously, having heard that, Rey no longer wants to kill him because that's not an outcome that she wants. I don't understand why he told her that. This is kind of an unprecedented concept, but I guess because he's repping all the Sith, and killing him would be an act of hatred, a Sith act. That means that if she kills him, he wins, and then because she's his granddaughter, he goes into her body. Then he opens his giant sunroof to show Rey that his Star Destroyers are currently killing all of her friends. And then soon, if her friends don't win, he's gonna fly off with his Star Destroyers and just blow up the majority of the planets. He tells her that if she does his Sith ritual where he goes into her body, then she'll have all that power of the Sith. So with that power, she could save her friends. So maybe actually it's a great idea and she should do it. But it's no, Rey gets the power, but Palpatine gets Rey's body. So it's kind of like Rey getting the power in name only, because she's not going to be able to actually protect anyone from anything bad happening, because I think she'll just be a vessel at that point, helplessly taking a back seat as the Sith use her body to kill all her friends and destroy all the planets like they would have done anyway. If anything, she'll just be putting them in worse danger by strengthening the enemy. At this point, my stupid brain, thinking things were still going to make some kind of sense, was I've cracked it. Palpatine is only thinking in terms of the Sith. He is looking at killing as an act of hatred. He believes Rey is here to kill him as an act of revenge for killing her parents. And revenge can only be an act of hate because it's not productive. It doesn't stop anything bad from happening. It's purely because you're angry and want someone to die. But Jedi have killed before when they have to, so it's not always a dark side act. They carry lethal weapons for a reason. And now Palpatine has made his fatal error. By bringing her friends into this, he has played himself. Rey will strike down Palpatine, but not as an act of revenge, as an act of love for her friends who are still alive and need to be protected by her, aka a thing that Jedi do literally all the time. It also kind of ties everything into a neat little bow, because The Last Jedi had that line about not fighting what you hate, but saving what you love. It would make sense that that was like a little buried nugget, like a piece of Jedi wisdom. And this would be a way for Rey to defeat the enemy without succumbing to the dark side and playing into his hands. And just like in the original trilogy, Palpatine's ultimate downfall would be his inability to account for acts of selfless love. And then we would leave the theater okay, well, I mean, it was kind of dumb that Palpatine came back, but at least everything circled back to the message of the other films, and they did find a way to wrap it up. And the emotional climax even wrapped up Rey's whole issue with her family, because she defeated her evil biological grandfather by caring only for her new friends. But wait, no, that's not what happened. Instead, Palpatine is
kill me and use my power to save your friend.
And Rey, like, agrees to it for some reason. Like, this sounds like her best option to her. And then we cut to a shot of Kylo Ren running in from a ship. We have to see him running away from the ship, or else we would be like, how did he get on this planet? Anyway, he's running in to help, and Rey's getting ready to do the ritual. Hurry, Kylo Ren! And then as she's getting ready to deal the killing blow, she force connects with Kylo Ren and they make eye contact. And you're like, oh, they're devising a plan together. And my stupid brain is still running on the assumption that something that happens will make sense. So I'm trying to figure out their plan. And I'm like, oh, okay, they established that force healing thing earlier, so maybe that will come back. Rey is lifting up her lightsaber like she's going to kill Palpatine. And I'm like, maybe instead she knows that Kylo Ren is here. So her thing is that she's actually going to stab herself. She's going to be either dead or grievously injured, and Palpatine's grand plan involves her being alive, so by taking herself off the board, she is thwarting his plan. And maybe that kind of self-sacrifice, being light-sided in nature, is enough of an inverse to Palpatine's evil Sith ritual that it will just straight up kill him. And even if it doesn't, it leaves the way clear for Kylo Ren to then run in and kill him. And then redeemed Ben Solo could use the Force to resurrect or heal Rey, returning the favor. Also, healing is a light side maneuver, or it used to be considered that, so that would kind of cement his place as being redeemed and on the light side. Maybe he could even reuse the incantation that Rey used earlier in the movie, where she was saying, be with me, and then he connects to the power of the other Jedi, which is pretty meaningful because, like, a lot of the dead Jedi were his family, so, like, you know, it's a nice little reunion and acceptance of him, and there's a nice ambiguity to the phrasing of it, like he's asking Rey not to die. Anyway, that definitely didn't happen either. Instead, Rey uses the connection to hand Ben one of her lightsabers, and then he uses it to fight off the Knights of Ren, and then she uses her other lightsaber to fight off all of Palpatine's goons, and they have a big lightsaber fight, and then he runs into where she is, and then they lift up their lightsabers to indicate that they're gonna try to kill Palpatine together. And then the audience applauds and stuff because they're gonna cut him in half, and it's gonna be satisfying. But then, like a stupid anime villain, Palpatine uses his force powers to lift them both up, and he starts cackling like an evil vampire, and he's like, this is actually a new version of my plan. I hope you guys love my Palpatine impression.
The life force of your bond strengthens me.
And then he says that they're part of a force dyad, a phrase that we've only heard one other time in the sequel trilogy, and back then it was also just Kylo Ren saying, we're a force dyad, without much further explanation. And then he yells, the power of two restores the one true emperor. And he starts like laughing and shooting lightning into the sky and whatever. It's just so stupid. So is force healing not a light side technique? Darksiders can just take life energy from any other force users at will by grabbing them? If Palpatine has the technology to grow multiple Snokes, and Snoke is extremely powerful in the force, and force energy is what Palpatine needs to suck up into his body to be alive and powerful, why didn't he just keep growing and harvesting as many Snokes as he needed to replenish his supply, and then be back in business? Or can you only forcibly take life energy if it's from a force dyad, a thing that hasn't happened in generations, but it can't just be from one of them? He can't just take it from Rey or Kylo. It has to be both of the people from the force dyad. They're in front of you, and you have to grab them, and then you detect by grabbing them that it's a force dyad. By grabbing them, did it just happen automatically? Because he seemed to figure it out in that moment. So is that just what happens when you grab two people from a force dyad, is all their life starts pouring into you? Because that seems badly thought out. Why would that be the case? It sounds like a huge drawback to anyone in a force dyad. And how is that on theme? What does that have to do with being connected to one other person in the force? That a third-party villain can also now take both your life energy. Number 18 is the force dyad. Surprise! So in the previous movies, I believed that the connection between Kylo Ren and Rey was sort of like a yin-yang kind of thing, like a balance to the force kind of thing. They had that whole line, darkness rises and the light to meet it. The rise of Skywalker makes it be because they both come from the strongest families. But why does that result in a dyad? It's not like for every generation, a Palpatine and a Skywalker are linked, because it hasn't happened before. Our pattern goes more like, in one generation, Anakin joined Palpatine, so the two families were working together. But then, ultimately, he fought him, so it was the opposite. I'm pretty sure those two never had a Force bond, because we saw them call each other on the hologram. One generation below that, a Skywalker fought a Palpatine, but the same Palpatine, at one point simultaneously to the Skywalker from the previous generation working with that Palpatine, and then they both worked against him together. The only prior Skywalker we know of is Shmi, who appears to have never met any Palpatine in her whole life. And the only other Palpatine we know about is Rey's mother or father, whichever of them came from the Palpatine side, and there's no indication that either of them interacted at any point with a Skywalker. So how are the families connected? And what do they mean, the most powerful families? Ben is only the third generation of Force user, and before that, Shmi didn't have the Force, so it's not like a great dynasty that's been going on for hundreds of years. And Rey is only the second generation, and it skipped a generation, to our knowledge, because I assume if one of her parents had the Force, they couldn't have been so easily stabbed to death. This isn't some case of destiny or history repeating itself. They're not even really the Space Hatfields and McCoys, because it seems like it's just different every time. Like it would be if you examined the history of any two random families interacting with each other. There's no character significance to it, or spiritual significance to it, or even a thematic thing. It's just like a random weird thing that happens and is meaningless, and then it never gets brought up again, so it didn't matter. 19, Kylo Ren's death. For the record, I don't hate the circumstances of Kylo Ren's death. They set up the Force healing thing earlier and established that it was like giving life to someone, so that implies that if you brought someone back from the dead, it would kill you. It's like how they had the lesbian kiss at the end, but then they had to have Poe make no homo eye contact with a lady character. It's the law of equivalent exchange. There's also a nice symmetry to it. It works thematically. They have those lines in The Force Awakens about how he wants to finish what his grandfather started. At the time, he meant it in kind of a diabolical way, but then if you think about it, you're like, oh, the reason Anakin fell to the dark side is he wanted to have the power to stop people he loved from dying. He turned to the dark side to try to do that, and it didn't work. He was also really selfish and kind of just wanted to have his hot wife around forever and didn't want to make any sacrifices for anybody else. So Kylo Ren getting redeemed and stopping someone he loves from dying, but doing it in a selfless way by sacrificing his own life, that's a good idea of like finishing what Darth Vader started. It all comes back. So I thought it was an okay conclusion. My issue with it was really just the same thing that I have an issue with in the whole rest of this movie, which is that it suffered from a lack of pacing and character development. His one scene where he gets redeemed, and then wordless fight, and then wordless resurrection of Rey, awkward eye contact, wordless kiss, and then wordlessly flopping over dead. It just feels so awkward. It got uncomfortable chuckles in every screening I went to. Besides, Rey is not his Padme. She's not even his girlfriend. If they had allotted some time in this one to build some kind of relationship foundation, I just feel like it would have been a much more fitting parallel. I mean, I love you is awkward on a first date, so I'm just gonna go ahead and say that pouring your life force into somebody, kissing them, and then falling over dead and vanishing from this plane of existence is also awkward on a first date. There was a lot of forward momentum to developing Kylo Ren and Rey's relationship in episode 8, but in this one, it just kind of pulled back on that. If anything, it felt like a backward movement. Every time they interacted, it was just kind of exposition, or I'm gonna getcha, or wordless fighting. It didn't feel like they had carried over a lot of the dynamic they had established in the last one. And then, from the point of his redemption clear to the end of the movie, Kylo Ren has no dialogue at all, which is such a weird choice. I mean, I guess the reason he had no dialogue is probably that the MPAA says you can only shout Rey 27 times in your film before they bump you up to an R rating. And obviously Finn had already blown through their quota. I think this whole thing would have just been much better if Kylo Ren had been redeemed earlier in the movie, and I don't know why they didn't do that. Also, it would have been funny to see Rey's friends trying to navigate this dynamic if they had the whole crew working together, which they should have, because that would be funny. And that might have even justified writing in Poe's weird drug dealer backstory backstory, because then it would be like, oh, people change, that's the moral or whatever. It's like, see, everybody on the good guy side has baggage. We've all done bad stuff before. What matters is where we are now. I mean, Rey hasn't done bad stuff before, but actually the next point on my list talks about Rey doing something bad. So see, they should just take all of my suggestions at the same time. We'll get to that in a minute. Instead, we get this weird silent interaction and then kiss, and then he dies, and Rey isn't even really that sad about it. She just kind of looks like confused at what she has seen, which, you know, is most of the audience watching The Rise of Skywalker. And I guess she can't be allowed to be that sad about it, because that would be an acknowledgement that this is kind of a downer ending to the movie. Maybe it's a good thing that they never adequately explained the Force dyad thing, because, like, if it is a yin-yang thing or a soulmates thing, then, like, I guess Rey is kind of screwed now, isn't she? Also, in the old movies, there was that prophecy about Darth Vader bringing balance to the Force, which I think was meant to ultimately be him defeating Palpatine. And that's when he fulfills that. But then Palpatine, it turns out, didn't die, so I guess that's just not canon anymore. Darth Vader failed and the prophecy never came true. So one would think that Ben being redeemed and then finding a way to live in harmony with his, like, yin-yang counterpart as part of a Force dyad would also count as bringing balance to the Force, and thus would also count as finishing what Darth Vader started. So they could have gone that route, but they didn't. Number 20 is the Dark Rey fake out. I really feel like there was some version of this script that was meant to grapple more with whether or not Rey was going to turn to the dark side. You know, that's an internal character conflict. It's interesting. You have all these weird leftover story beats where Rey will do a dark side-esque thing. It's pretty bad. And then it's just never addressed again in any subsequent scene. At the beginning of the movie, she savagely beats her training droid to death with her stick and accidentally drops a tree on BB-8. She feels like super bad about it in the moment, but then it cuts to another scene and Poe sees that BB-8 is damaged and is angry, and she's like, leave me alone, he's fine. And then later we see that Rey is unnerved by the sight of that ship in the desert. Remember, the blue Honda Civic. And initially I thought it was going to go a very different direction. I thought that being in the middle of a desert and watching someone she loved be carried away on a spaceship and reaching out to be like, no, don't go, I thought that was going to jog a traumatic memory about her parents. We also have all those parts where Kylo Ren is like, you don't know the whole truth about your parents, so that also supported this theory. So my conspiracy theory is that Rey's parents were flying away on their spaceship, either for a good reason or because they were jerks and they sold her for drinking money, and she reflexively reached out as a little baby and is like, no, come back. And then, because she had Force powers she didn't know about, she accidentally caused a crash and is the reason her parents are dead. That would be a good Dark Rey conversation piece, wouldn't it? Like, it's not her fault, it was an accident. I mean, it is her fault, but it was an accident. But it would make her worry that she was evil and that her destiny was to be a Darksider. And that's a disturbing thing for Kylo Ren to be able to reveal to her, especially since he's trying to turn her to the dark side. And especially because he killed one of his own parents. So for him, it's, you know, like a bonding thing. I mean, he killed his a little less accidentally, but he thinks he can never be redeemed because of it. So that could have been an interesting similarity between them, and then they could each deal with it in their own way. But no, they didn't do that. There isn't even any kind of line drawn, like symbolically, between the imagery of Rey reaching out for the ship in the desert with someone flying away on it and not wanting it to leave, which seems like kind of a weird missed opportunity. I don't know, maybe J.J. Abrams just hadn't watched The Force Awakens in a while and he forgot about that. Anyway, Rey explodes Chewbacca and she's super upset, and then they go on their mission to the next planet, and then she's totally back to normal. Finn tries to interrupt Rey when she's having a lightsaber fight with Kylo Ren, and she roughly force throws him away. She throws him like a good 10 feet. That's never brought up again. Rey has a long duel with Kylo Ren, in which he keeps pulling his punches. He's not really trying to kill her, and then in a moment when his guard is down and he's unarmed, she stabs him in the gut to murder him. So then the culmination of all this is that she tries to exile herself to the island like Luke did, and she's like, I'm a monster. And then Luke's Force Ghost appears and he's like, no, you're fine. And then that's that. It's over. That's it. You'd think a character beat like that would be carried through to the final conflict, especially since she's facing like the avatar of the dark side and a biological member of her family who wants her to take after him, but instead they just resolve it ahead of time. Ultimately, the climax of the movie isn't about internal struggle or resisting darkness. It's just figuring out a way to kill Palpatine. Palpatine has all these ships. He's gonna blow everybody up, and you gotta stop him by killing him. Palpatine isn't even really trying to turn her to the dark side as any kind of moral dilemma. He's just trying to emotionally blackmail her into doing a Sith ritual that will let him possess her body. There's no tension in that scene of Rey actually falling to the dark side. It's just kind of a, will Palpatine overpower her physically? It's not about a moral lesson or personal growth or a deeper theme. It's just about whether or not Rey can produce a powerful enough laser to defeat an evil cackling Frankenstein monster she met 10 minutes ago. Speaking of cackling evil Frankenstein, number 21, Rey Palpatine. Rey being a Palpatine is the most unforgivably stupid thing in this movie. In fact, I think I've even said in previous videos, Rey shouldn't be related to anyone, but if she is, she should be a Palpatine, because that would be the stupidest thing for it to be, and that would be so funny. Haha. And then she could shoot Force lightning out of her hands. LOL, imagine that. Well, in this movie we get that. It's real. I dug my own grave with my funnies. So let me just rewind for a second. Rey being a nobody is thematically important because her character foil, Kylo Ren's baggage, is his legacy. He felt doomed, obligated, destined, etc. to carry on in his grandfather's evil footsteps as soon as he learned his identity. And he had already spent his whole youth trying to live up to the greatness of his uncle and his mom, so it's just a lot of pressure from all sides. Rey, by contrast, has no legacy, and that's her emotional baggage. Her family is just a vague, abstract concept in her mind, but she'd like to have a family. When we first meet her, she's angsting over the prospect of dying alone and forgotten on Jakku. Kylo Ren feels entitled to things, like power, politically, and to be the strongest Force user, specifically because of his family line. He expresses this the most literally when he feels entitled to Anakin's lightsaber and is like enraged at the idea of some nobody using it. So Rey being a nobody affirms that worthiness doesn't come from bloodlines. She is nobody, and she's powerful in the Force, and that's important. Force ability is about spirituality, self-awareness, meditation. It's not about growing the most powerful stable of Force users you can like they're racehorses. I felt like this was all pretty obviously spelled out by the end of episode 8. They had that scene of the kid with the broom, and they suggest that he's Force sensitive, and it's like, oh, Force can come from anywhere, Ratatouille, etc. I don't think Broom Boy was intended to be Qui-Gon Jinn's grandnephew. Episode 9 narrows the scope. With Kylo Ren dead, we really just have Rey. Oh, and Finn. Finn has Force abilities, but they're not as strong, probably because his family is not important enough. The Rise of Skywalker tells us that Rey is a Palpatine, and not only does that matter, it's actually the reason for everything that's ever happened in her entire life. She was orphaned on Jakku because she was a Palpatine. She isn't linked to Kylo Ren because some quality of her soul makes her a meaningful counterpart to him. It's just because they both came from important families. She's a Palpatine and he's a Skywalker, whatever that means. Rey isn't powerful because the Force chose her for her intrinsic goodness or some other machination of destiny. She is really powerful because she inherited the powerful Force gene from her evil Frankenstein grandfather's side of the family, a gene which I guess is recessive. It's a really bleak message to me. Revealing that Rey comes from a powerful family and that that's the reason for everything doesn't make her more important within the story, it just removes her agency. It makes her accomplishments no longer her own, so I think that's bad. I don't like it. When Kylo Ren is revealing Rey's family to her, she's like shaking her head and she's like, I don't want this. And I'm like, girl, same. Finally, number 22, Rey Skywalker. In the final scene of the film, Rey goes to Tatooine, because it's a location that the audience recognizes, to bury Luke and Leia's lightsabers side by side, like they're married or something. Then a convenient stranger happens by and asks for her first and last name, and she says Rey Skywalker. The scene is awful. Tatooine has no positive significance for Rey or Leia or even really Luke. Luke hated it and thought it was boring and wanted to leave, and his only family there was also brutally murdered. Leia was a slave there to a giant slug monster. In the entire series, no character has any affection for desert planets. They're just terrible wastelands where people starve and slavery is legal. Rey isn't creating a memorial or a place for grieving or whatever because it's just an unmarked pit in the desert. Even if this was intended as a grave, I kind of highly doubt that either character would have wanted their grave to be here. I don't even know why the lightsabers had to be symbolically laid to rest. It's not like Rey is ending the Jedi or the sabers are a terrible power which cannot fall into the wrong hands, because Rey just made a new one anyway. There are still lightsabers kicking around. When Jedi die, isn't it tradition for their lightsabers to be passed down to new trainees until they can build their own? You'd think Finn could have benefited from one of those because he's Force sensitive. Maybe that hadn't been written in yet when they shot this scene, and then J.J. Abrams forgot about it. Why does Rey decide to call herself Skywalker? Because the only Skywalker she actually knew was Luke, and their relationship was pretty contentious for most of it. Leia was from the Skywalker bloodline, but she never identified as such. In fact, I don't know if it's canon anymore, but there are EU books that address this, and she was never there when Vader got redeemed, and never felt like she had made peace with the idea that he was her father, because he blew up her whole planet and murdered her parents. So I don't think she would like to even be identified as a Skywalker. So why not Organa or Solo? Han and Ben were ultimately positive influences in her life, and that's a name with a lot less baggage. Or why not Palpatine? Because her grandfather was evil, but according to this movie, her parents were super cool and loved her and died to save her. So wouldn't that be a lovely tribute to them? Screw them, I guess. I assume the Skywalker ending is going for that found family angle, the family that you choose, but the family that she's choosing is 100% dead. Why not, for the last shot, just show Rey happy with her Resistance friends and be like, oh, she's not alone anymore? Is there any indication that they're going to stay close now and in each other's lives now that the war is over? Where did they go? Why aren't they hanging out with her? How is it empowering that our final image of Rey is her standing sad and alone with no clear direction in a desert just as empty and desolate as the place she was stranded when we first met her? Is Rey going to lead a new generation of Jedi? Did she decide? Has she thought about it? We don't know. Apparently it doesn't matter. What matters is that the movie shows us that she has built a new lightsaber and it is yellow, because the fans wanted to know what color lightsaber she has. That's our final beat in the movie. It's Rey Skywalker, new lightsaber, just ticking off another box of meaningless information with no emotion behind it. Oh boy, I can't wait to walk out of this theater having felt nothing and update Wikipedia. This whole film is just a weird checklist of things that are meant to satisfy Star Wars fans, but none of them are covered in a satisfying way. They're just passionlessly recited to us. People wanted Ben Solo to be redeemed, so he just is redeemed. There's just one scene where that happens. It's not really built up to in this movie. The Last Jedi built up to it. He was halfway there already, but then they reset it in this one. There's no sense of gradual progression, so his redemption just feels really hollow. Then after he's redeemed, he has literally no lines of dialogue. People wanted to know if Finn is force sensitive, so halfway through, he just tells us he is force sensitive. It's not a triumphant moment. It doesn't add anything to the film's final battle. It's just a thing that we're told. Fans were upset that Admiral Akbar died, so they made a point of having a scene where Poe addresses Amon Calamari and calls him Junior, so we can surmise that this is Admiral Akbar Jr. and his legacy lives on. So now it's better now. And not all of these things are even bad concepts. I feel like if before this movie you just showed me a list of things that happen in the movie, I'd be like, okay, this sounds like a movie I would want to watch. But if you showed me a list of things and said, this is the movie, I would say, what? No, this isn't. This is just a list of things. I'm saying that's what J.J. Abrams did. I'd probably also be like, please take Rey Palpatine off this list. It's very stupid. I find it pretty funny that I just covered that terrible Alan Dean Foster pitch for episode 9, only to watch the real one and see it fall into many of the same pitfalls. It seems like J.J. Abrams had an idea for what he wanted episode 8 to be, but then he didn't do episode 8, and then he also didn't tell anybody what his idea was. And then he came back and his ideas didn't make sense anymore, and instead of being a talented writer and just leaning into the challenge and working with what he already had to make a new good story, he was like, that's okay, I'll just make episode 8 and 9, but I'll make them both episode 9. And it's well, no, if you wanted episode 8, you should have made episode 8. But you didn't, and now you have to do a new thing. I think the most obvious symptom of this issue is the way he dealt with Rose Tico, by which I mean he didn't deal with Rose Tico, he just wrote her out. Finn and Poe had so little to do in this story that honestly, if he had just had Rose also be there and given her 2 more lines but had her physically present, I feel like people wouldn't have even noticed that he wrote her out. They would have just been like, well, she had about as big of a role as Poe and Finn, so I guess it's fine. But instead, J.J. Abrams is I don't know her, and he just writes her out, and it's dude, then figure it out. Be a writer. It feels like he didn't even try. It's he totally gave up. And I don't mean to put it all on him, because this story obviously saw several major overhauls and probably ultimately was a million hours of footage that all had to be somehow edited down. I'm sure a lot of those decisions were coming from committees and higher-ups other than JJ, and he was probably working under very intense circumstances, but I was just surprised to see it go quite so wrong. Anyway, I really like the characters of the sequel trilogy, and I'll probably still be able to enjoy watching episodes 7 and 8, which I thought were worked. But this whole time I just kind of gave the benefit of the doubt that this was all leading somewhere. And this film makes it very obvious that it never was. Or maybe it once was, and in the end it just didn't. Everything in this one just feels made up on the spot and then rendered even more incoherent by a bunch of rewrites. Maybe once there was a version of this that was good, or maybe the original was even worse and we were doomed from the start. I think the worst thing a franchise ending can do is make you feel kind of stupid and embarrassed for being so excited about it in the first place. I thought going into it that I might not like where some of the characters ended up, especially in an era of filmmaking where it seems more important to make sure that the audience doesn't predict what's going to happen over making a satisfying ending. But I wasn't even really sad or mad about any of the story developments because it was so sloppy that it totally broke my suspension of disbelief. I didn't even feel like I was watching a Star Wars movie. I felt like I was watching a weird fan film. It kind of just didn't make me feel anything at all. So that's... I was trying to think of something funnier to go out on, but that's just kind of what I got. I didn't like The Rise of Skywalker very much. The best part of the movie for me was anytime that 7-foot-tall yellow slug was on screen. Anytime it was in frame next to a human, I was newly delighted at just how giant of a slug it really was. Infuriatingly, I haven't seen any substantial merchandise of this slug, like it's on stickers and posters. There are no plush of this slug. You know, at several points in the movie when Poe is reflecting on what they have lost, and he keeps saying, if this doesn't work, it will all have been for nothing. Well, like, that's kind of me with The Rise of Skywalker and getting merch for the giant slug.